My daughter and her husband abandoned me in a Michelin star restaurant with the bill in my name. By dawn, they would learn I had also frozen their cards. I never imagined my own flesh and blood could make me feel so invisible. Today, I'm going to tell you something I never thought I'd share. And if you, for even a second, feel like this sounds familiar, I just ask that you leave a like and subscribe. It will help me to keep unburdening myself. My name is Deborah Miller. I'm 69 years old, and I live in a modest neighborhood in Atlanta, in a house I inherited from my parents over 40 years ago. The walls are covered in siding that has faded to a pale yellow under the Georgia sun, and the concrete patio still has the cracks my late husband promised to fix, but never had time to before a stroke took him, leaving me alone with a 12-year-old girl and a world that felt like it was falling apart. My entire life was dedicated to one person, my daughter, Lucy. From the moment she was born, with those big, dark eyes that seemed to hold the whole universe, I knew I would give my last breath for her. I worked in the kitchen of a private school for 30 years, waking up at 5 in the morning to catch the MARTA bus that took me to the other side of the city, where I prepared breakfast for children from wealthy families who never saw me as anything more than the person who served them freshly squeezed orange juice. My hands, rough and stained from years of peeling potatoes and washing industrial pans, never rested. When I came home in the afternoons with swollen feet and an aching back, I still had to cook for Lucy, help her with her homework, iron her uniform, and make sure she had everything she needed to be a happy little girl. I sold the few pieces of gold jewelry my mother had left me to pay for her English classes at an expensive academy because Lucy insisted that all her friends went there, and she didn't want to be left out. When Lucy turned 23 and met Richard Baker, a 32-year-old man who worked at a tech company and drove a BMW that gleamed under the Atlanta sun like a jewel, I thought my daughter had finally found the stability I could never give her. Richard came from an upper-middle-class family in Sandy Springs, wore designer shirts, and spoke with that tone of superiority common among people accustomed to the world bending to their will. From the beginning, Richard treated me like I was part of the furniture. When he came to pick Lucy up for their dates, he would greet me with a barely perceptible nod, never truly looking me in the eye. Lucy, my sweet Lucy, began to change. She stopped asking for my advice. She started criticizing the way I dressed, my southern accent, the way I pronounced certain words. "Mom, it's supposedly, not supposably," she would correct me with a condescending smile that made me feel small, insignificant, as if the years I spent working to educate her were worthless. They were married in a small ceremony at the Basilica of the Sacred Heart of Jesus in downtown. I wore the same navy blue dress I had worn to my cousin's wedding years before because I didn't have money for a new one. Lucy asked me not to invite many of our relatives, "So it doesn't look so unbalanced," she said. Richard's family filled most of the pews, with their elegant suits and imported perfumes that filled the air of the old church. After the wedding, when they needed the down payment for their apartment in a modern high-rise in Buckhead, complete with a gym and a rooftop pool, Lucy came to my house one Sunday afternoon. She sat in the same wooden chair where she used to do her homework as a child and, in a soft, almost childish voice, said, "Mom, we need your help. It's just a loan. We'll pay you back in 6 months." I took out my savings, $10,000 I had gathered dollar by dollar over 15 years, hidden in a Danish cookie tin in the back of my closet. I never saw that money again. When I asked about it months later, Richard said dismissively, "Deborah, that was a family gift, not a loan. Don't be petty." The years passed like pages of a calendar no one bothers to read. I had 2 grandchildren, Jacob and Sophia, now 8 and 6. Those children became my reason for getting up every morning. I was the one who looked after them when Lucy and Richard had important commitments. I picked them up from school, made them grilled cheese sandwiches, read them stories before bed when they stayed at my house on weekends. Jacob called me my favorite grandma, and Sophia drew me flowers on crumpled sheets of paper that I kept like treasures. But Lucy and Richard only called when they needed me. "Mom, can you watch the kids this weekend? We have a work trip to Miami." "Mom, can you lend us money for the car? It broke down and we need to fix it." "Mom, the kids have a field trip and we need you to pay for half." It was always Mom when they wanted something, but never a, "How are you?" or "Do you need anything?" When I was coughing for weeks with a flu I couldn't shake because I didn't have money for a private doctor. One afternoon in March, when the Atlanta heat was starting to become unbearable and the azaleas painted the streets in shades of pink and white, my phone rang. It was Lucy. Her tone unusually sweet, almost syrupy, like when she was a little girl and wanted me to buy her something from the store. "Mom, Richard and I want to take you out to dinner, to a special restaurant, to thank you for everything you've done for us." My heart, so accustomed to crumbs of affection, filled with a foolish, warm hope. I thought that finally, after so many years of giving without receiving, my sacrifices would be recognized. I put on my best dress, a wine-colored one I had bought at a local market, and even put on a little makeup with the old cosmetics I had saved. Richard picked me up in his BMW, and Lucy was in the passenger seat, staring at her phone with that distant expression she had perfected over the years. The restaurant was in an exclusive part of Atlanta I barely knew, where the streets were impeccably clean and the parked cars were worth more than my entire house. Aurelia, the place was called. "A Michelin star," Richard explained with the tone of someone educating the ignorant. The entrance was discreet but intimidating, with a carved wooden door and a doorman in a black suit who opened it with a bow. The interior looked like something out of a European magazine. High ceilings, crystal chandeliers hanging like frozen tears, tables separated by frosted glass panels that offered privacy without complete isolation. We sat at a table by a window overlooking an inner garden lit with soft lights. I felt out of place, with my market dress among so many elegant diners. The menu had no prices, only poetic descriptions of dishes whose names I could barely pronounce. When the waiter, a young man no older than 25 with a French accent, asked me what I wanted to drink, I asked for still water. Richard shot me a look full of contempt and leaned towards me, whispering with a venomous voice, "Don't order anything expensive, mother-in-law. This is for people who know how to eat, not for you." Lucy, my own daughter, the child I carried for 9 months in my womb and nursed until I bled, let out a nervous laugh and nodded. "Yeah, Mom. Behave. Don't embarrass us in front of these people." Her words fell on me like stones thrown from the top of a building. Each syllable was a blow that echoed in my chest, in that place where I kept all the memories of caring for her when she had a fever at 3 in the morning, of sewing her school play costumes until my fingers went numb, of turning down proposals from good men because "Lucy needs me. I can't think about myself right now." The waiter returned with a bottle of wine that Richard had ordered without consulting me. A French label with an impossible name that he pronounced with a perfect accent to impress the diners at nearby tables. He uncorked the bottle with ceremonial movements, while Richard sniffed the cork with the expression of a connoisseur. He took a sip, swirled the red liquid in his glass, as he had seen in movies, and nodded in approval. "Excellent vintage," he said, glancing at me to make sure I noticed his supposed sophistication. Lucy ordered caviar as an appetizer. I didn't even really know what caviar was, only that it was something rich people ate on TV shows. When it arrived at the table, served on a bed of ice with tiny mother-of-pearl spoons, Richard took a generous portion and spread it on a tiny piece of toast. "It's authentic beluga caviar," he explained to no one in particular. "From Iran. Costs more than you make in a month, mother-in-law." He popped the entire toast into his mouth and chewed with his eyes closed, feigning culinary ecstasy. I looked at my empty plate. No one had offered me a taste. Lucy and Richard ate as if they were alone in the restaurant, talking to each other about a trip they were planning to Europe, about the bilingual private schools where they wanted to enroll the children, about the possibility of buying a bigger house in Sandy Springs, in a gated community with 24-hour security. I was just another piece of furniture at that table, a necessary prop to complete the scene but with no voice or vote. When the main course arrived, a cut of meat the waiter described as Wagyu beef tenderloin with a red wine reduction and black truffle foam, I realized there was nothing in front of me. I discreetly signaled the waiter, who approached with a confused expression. "Excuse me, I think they forgot my plate," I said in a barely audible voice, ashamed to draw attention. The young man looked at his notepad and then at Richard, who interrupted without looking up from his steak. The lady didn't order a main course. She's just having water. She's on a diet. My stomach clenched. I hadn't eaten since noon. I had left home excited, without having lunch, thinking this dinner would be special. Now I was sitting here watching my daughter and her husband devour expensive food while I swallowed saliva and tried to ignore the growling of my empty stomach. The waiter looked at me with something resembling pity and quietly withdrew. Richard cut a piece of steak and chewed it slowly, letting out exaggerated sounds of pleasure. "My God, this is spectacular. Lucy, try mine." He extended his fork, and she took the bite, closing her eyes dramatically. "It's perfect, honey. Worth every penny." They looked at each other with complicity, as if sharing a private joke from which I was excluded, and maybe they were. Maybe this was all a cruel joke whose punchline I had yet to understand. Between courses, Lucy told me about her problems. "The kids are being impossible lately, Mom. Jacob doesn't want to do his homework, and Sophia cries about everything. I think they need to spend more time with you. You always calm them down better than I can." Translation: I need you to go back to being their free nanny while I do yoga and get my nails done. Richard complained about his job, about how his boss didn't recognize his talent, about how he deserved a promotion he was being unfairly denied. "With what I make now, we can barely maintain our lifestyle," he said while ordering his third glass of $40 wine. Dessert arrived. An elaborate construction of chocolate with edible gold, red berries, and a sauce the waiter drizzled with a blowtorch in front of us, creating a small blue flame that drew applause from other tables. Lucy and Richard shared the dessert, feeding each other with small spoons while I continued with my glass of water, which I had already refilled 3 times because I didn't know what else to do with my hands. The restaurant was starting to empty. It was almost 11 at night. I was tired, hungry, and had a headache pounding in my temples. But above all, I was hurt in a way that had no name. It wasn't just physical hunger. It was a hunger for respect, for consideration, for that filial love I had given without measure, and was now being denied with such casual cruelty. Richard ordered a digestive, a yellow liqueur that came in a small glass and smelled of herbs. He drank it in one gulp and let out a sigh of satisfaction. Then he took out his phone and frowned at the screen. "Damn. I have an urgent call from the office. It's from New York. Time difference. I can't miss it." Bani, he stood up without looking at me, without saying goodbye, and walked towards the restaurant exit with the phone pressed to his ear. I saw him go through the carved wooden door and disappear into the Atlanta night. 5 minutes passed. 10. Lucy looked at her own phone with a bored expression, swiping her finger across the screen, probably looking at Instagram or Facebook, checking on the perfect lives of her friends. Then, as if she had just remembered something, she also stood up. "Oh, Mom, I need to go to the restroom. I'll be right back." She picked up her Michael Kors bag, the one I had helped her pay for when she turned 30, and headed towards the restrooms. I watched her walk on her high heels, her tight black dress showing off her figure, her long hair falling over her shoulders like a dark waterfall. I waited. 15 minutes. 20. 25. The restaurant was now almost empty. Only 2 other tables were occupied besides ours. The waiters were starting to clear tablecloths, stack chairs, performing those closing tasks that signal the establishment is about to close. I felt uncomfortable, out of place, as if I were intruding on a space where I no longer belonged. I stood up on trembling legs and walked towards the restroom area. I knocked on the women's restroom door. "Lucy? Are you okay, honey?" Silence. I opened the door. The restrooms were empty. Impeccably clean, with their spotless mirrors and marble sinks, but empty. Completely empty. I felt the air leave my lungs. I returned to the dining room, almost running, looking for Richard in some corner. Nothing. I went out to the entrance. The doorman looked at me with a neutral expression. "Did you see a man in a gray suit and a woman in a black dress leave?" "Yes, ma'am. They left about half an hour ago. They left in a black car." The world began to spin around me. I leaned against the wall to keep from falling. They had left. They had abandoned me. My own daughter and her husband had brought me to this expensive place, humiliated me for hours, and now had left me alone as if I were trash to be thrown on any street corner. I returned to the dining room, my legs so weak they could barely hold me. The waiter who had served us all night approached me with a silver tray in his hands. On it rested a wine-colored leather folder, the kind of elegant folder that only contains bad news when you don't have money. "Your check, ma'am," he said in a professional but not hostile voice, as if he were used to witnessing small human dramas in this place where the rich played with other people's lives. My hands trembled as I opened the folder. The numbers danced before my eyes. I tried to focus, to understand what I was seeing, but my brain refused to process the information. $1,840. $1,840. The number repeated in my mind like a mantra of destruction. That was more than 2 months of my Social Security check. More than I earned in half a year when I still worked in the school kitchen. An impossible, unreachable, astronomical amount for someone like me. "There must be a mistake," I muttered, my voice sounding strange even to me, raspy and high-pitched at the same time. I barely ordered anything. I only had water. My daughter and her husband. They invited me. They ordered all of this. The waiter looked at me with a mixture of compassion and resignation that made me feel even smaller. "Ma'am, the reservation is under your name, Deborah Miller, and you signed the order at the beginning of dinner. Remember? When you arrived, the manager asked for your ID and you signed a document." The memory came back like a lightning bolt. Yes, I had signed something. Richard had said it was just a restaurant protocol, a formality. Everyone has to do it. I had signed without reading, trusting, always trusting that my daughter wouldn't hurt me. How stupid I had been. How incredibly naive and stupid. "But I can't pay this," I said, feeling tears welling up behind my eyes, though I refused to let them fall in front of these strangers. "I don't have this kind of money. I don't even have a credit card. My daughter, she said it was an invitation. That they wanted to thank me." My voice broke on the last word. The waiter looked away, uncomfortable, and muttered something about having to call the manager. A few minutes later, a man in his 50s, with an impeccable dark suit and a stern expression that seemed permanently etched on his face, approached my table. He introduced himself as Mr. Evans, the general manager of Aurelia. He sat down across from me without an invitation, folded his hands on the table, and looked at me with those cold eyes of someone who has seen too much and is no longer surprised by human misery. "Mrs. Miller, I understand you're in a difficult situation," he began in a controlled voice, as if reading from a corporate script. "However, you signed the liability document upon entering the establishment. The bill is legally in your name. If the people who accompanied you decided to leave, that is a situation you will have to resolve with them later. But the restaurant cannot absorb that loss." "I don't have the money," I repeated, my voice barely a choked whisper. "I live on a Social Security check of $900 a month. This is impossible for me. Please, you have to understand. They tricked me. My own daughter tricked me." The words tumbled out, desperate, and I hated how my voice sounded, pleading and pathetic, like a wounded animal begging for mercy. Mr. Evans sighed, checked his gold watch, and then looked at me with an expression that wasn't quite cruel, but wasn't kind either. It was simply practical, businesslike, devoid of humanity. "Ma'am, if you cannot settle the bill tonight, I will have to call the authorities. It's our protocol. I cannot make exceptions no matter how unfortunate your situation may be. Authorities, police, a scene, arrest." The words spun in my head like vultures. I imagined myself in handcuffs, put in a patrol car, booked like a criminal, my mugshot in police records. At 69, with my high blood pressure and my arthritis, ending my life in a cell because of my own daughter's cruelty. I felt nauseous. The elegant dining room of Aurelia began to spin, the crystal chandeliers turning into blurry stars, and I had to grip the edge of the table to keep from falling off my chair. "Please," I managed to say, though I no longer knew what I was asking for. "Mercy? Time? A miracle?" The manager stood up. "I'll give you 30 minutes to make some calls, see if someone can help you. But after that, I will have to proceed according to our protocol." He walked away with measured steps, leaving me alone in that hall that now felt like a mausoleum of marble and glass. I took out my old cell phone with trembling hands. The screen was cracked in one corner, the result of a fall months ago that I hadn't been able to afford to fix. I dialed Lucy's number. 1, 2, 3 rings. Voicemail. I dialed again. Voicemail. A third time. Voicemail. Then I dialed Richard's number. It didn't even ring. It went straight to voicemail. They had blocked me. Or turned off their phones. Or simply decided that I no longer existed for them. I thought about who else I could call. My mind ran through the pathetic list of my social life. I had no living siblings. My cousins lived in other states, and we hadn't spoken in years beyond birthday wishes on Facebook. The neighbors in my neighborhood were good people, but just as poor as I was. Who was I going to wake up at 11 at night to ask for almost $2,000? It was absurd. Ridiculous. Impossible. The waiters finished cleaning all the tables except mine. They glanced at me, whispering among themselves, probably betting on whether I'd end up arrested or if by some miracle I'd get the money. I was their end-of-shift entertainment. The drama of the night they would tell their families tomorrow. You won't believe what happened at the restaurant last night. The manager returned exactly 30 minutes later. He stood before me with an impatient expression. "Well, Mrs. Miller?" I shook my head, unable to speak. He sighed deeply, took out his phone, and began to dial. I closed my eyes, preparing for the inevitable, for the final humiliation of seeing the police arrive, of being treated like a con artist when I had only been the victim of the person I trusted most in this world. But then, a voice interrupted the scene. "Excuse me, Mr. Evans." It was the young waiter who had served us, the one with the French accent. He approached and spoke in a low voice to the manager, something I couldn't hear. I saw the manager frown, shake his head, but the waiter insisted, gesturing towards me, arguing something with his hands. Finally, the manager put his phone away and addressed me again. "The waiter, Antoine, suggests a temporary solution," he said, his tone still formal but less hostile. "You can leave your official ID as collateral and sign a promissory note. You have 1 week to pay the bill. After that, we will proceed legally. Is that acceptable?" It wasn't acceptable. Nothing about this was acceptable. But it was better than going to jail tonight. I nodded like a broken spring-loaded doll, took my state ID out of my worn purse, and handed it over. I signed the note without reading it. Because what did it matter anymore? My life was destroyed anyway. Antoine, the waiter, walked me to the exit. At the door, he stopped me by gently touching my arm. "Ma'am, what they did to you is cruel. Very cruel. I'm sorry." His eyes showed genuine compassion. I've seen many things in this job, but this was pure evil. I thanked him in a thin voice and stepped out into the Atlanta night, into the humid air that smelled of azaleas and gasoline, into a city that suddenly seemed strange and hostile. I had no money for a taxi or an Uber. My purse contained exactly $3.43 in loose change that jingled with every step like a metallic mockery of my situation. I walked through streets I didn't know well, my low-heeled shoes suddenly feeling like instruments of torture, each step sending shooting pains from my swollen feet to my arthritic knees. The neon lights of the area's exclusive bars and restaurants reflected in puddles left by an early rain, creating artificial rainbows that seemed obscene in their beauty. I passed by young couples laughing, holding hands, coming out of movie theaters and coffee shops. I saw entire families dining in restaurants with large windows, happy children eating pizza while their parents watched them with tenderness. Every image was a knife in my chest, a reminder of everything I had lost, of the family I thought I had, which turned out to be a lie built on my naivety and my desperate need to be loved. I finally found a bus stop. I sat on the cold metal bench, under the yellowish light that attracted moths and mosquitoes, and waited. 1 bus, 2, 3. None were going towards my neighborhood. It was past midnight, and the night routes were limited. Next to me, a man who smelled of alcohol muttered incomprehensibly. A young woman in a nurse's uniform dozed with her head against the glass of the bus shelter, exhausted after a shift that had probably lasted 12 hours. When a bus finally arrived that would at least get me closer to my area, I struggled up the high steps, paid my fare, and collapsed into the first available seat. The bus smelled of tired humanity, of night workers' sweat, of cheap perfumes mixed with the greasy aroma of fast food someone had eaten on the way. I felt so out of place after having been in that luxury restaurant, as if I had briefly visited another planet and was now crashing back to my usual reality. I got home after 2 in the morning, My feet were bleeding inside my shoes. I opened the rusty wrought iron gate that creaked as always, crossed the small yard where the geranium pots I tended so carefully looked like ghostly shadows in the moonlight, and entered my living room. Everything was exactly as I had left it. The same old television, the same worn-out sofa covered with the crocheted blanket my mother made before she died. The same pictures on the wall showing a smiling Lucy at different stages of her life. Her first communion, her middle school graduation, her wedding. I collapsed onto the sofa and then, only then, when I was completely alone in the darkness of my house, did I let myself cry. They weren't delicate tears. They were deep sobs that came from some primitive place inside me. Wails that sounded almost animal-like, as if all the accumulated pain of years of being used, ignored, and despised had finally found an escape. I cried for the girl I once was, who grew up without a father and promised to give her daughter everything she never had. I cried for the young mother who worked until her hands bled so that Lucy could have a better life. I cried for the woman who gave everything and received only crumbs of affection in return. I cried until there were no tears left, until my throat burned and my head throbbed with a dull ache. When the tears dried up, I sat in the darkness, staring at those pictures on the wall. I stood up, turned on the living room light, though it made me blink from the sudden brightness, and walked over to the photos. I studied Lucy's face in each one. When had the change begun? At what exact moment did the sweet girl who hugged me and said, "I love you, Mommy," transform into this woman capable of abandoning me in a restaurant with an unpayable debt? Perhaps it had been gradual. Perhaps every time I gave in to her whims, every time I paid for something I shouldn't have, every time I accepted being treated like an employee instead of a mother, I had contributed to creating the monster she had become. Or perhaps she had always been this way, and I had simply refused to see it, blinded by that unconditional love that mothers feel, and that makes us stupid, vulnerable, willing to believe any lie just to maintain the illusion that our children love us. I went to the kitchen and opened the refrigerator. There was a bit of last week's beans, 3 hard tortillas, half a browned avocado. I heated the beans in a small pot, the familiar smell filling the narrow kitchen. I ate standing by the stove, directly from the pot, because I no longer had the energy to even put the food on a plate. The beans tasted like ash in my mouth, but my empty stomach welcomed them with relief. After eating, I sat at the kitchen table, that scratched wooden table where I had prepared thousands of meals, where I had helped Lucy with her homework, where I had paid bills and counted coins trying to stretch every dollar. I took out my phone and dialed Lucy's number again. Voicemail. I dialed Richard. Voicemail. I tried 5 more times with the same result. Finally, I sent them a text message, my fingers trembling on the cracked screen. "How could you do this to me? I have to pay $1,840 in 1 week or they're going to sue me. Please answer. I'm your mother." The message was marked as delivered, then as read, but no reply came. The minutes passed. 10, 20, 30. Nothing. The silence was their answer. The silence was their way of telling me that they no longer cared, that I had served my purpose and was now disposable, an old piece of furniture that was no longer useful. I stared at the phone until the screen went black. Then something strange happened inside me. The sadness began to transform. It didn't disappear, but it changed shape, like water turning to ice. It became hard, cold, solid. For the first time in my life, I felt something I had never allowed to grow before. Rage. Pure, clean, justified rage. It wasn't the fleeting anger that dissipates with time. It was something deeper, older, more powerful. I rose from the chair with slow, deliberate movements. I walked to my small bedroom and opened the closet. On the top shelf, behind old sheets and winter blankets, was the shoebox where I kept important documents. I took it down, blew the dust off the lid, and opened it on my bed. Inside were my birth certificate, my marriage certificate, Social Security papers, and something else, a bank passbook. Years ago, my late husband, Joseph, had convinced me to open a savings account. "For emergencies, Debbie," he would say, using the affectionate nickname no one else used. For 20 years, I had deposited small amounts, $50 here, $100 there, whenever I managed to set something aside from the household budget. When Joseph died, he left a modest life insurance policy that I deposited entirely into that account. I never touched it. I hadn't even told Lucy about its existence, some survival instinct making me keep that secret. I opened the passbook with trembling hands. The last recorded balance was from 6 months ago, $8,700. With the accumulated interest, it was probably around $9,000 now. It was my safety net, the financial cushion that let me sleep at night, knowing that in any medical emergency or crisis, I wouldn't be completely destitute. But there was something else about that account, something I remembered at that moment with crystalline clarity. When Lucy got married, she insisted I make her a beneficiary of the account, in case something happens to you, Mom, to avoid legal paperwork. And even more, I had given her an additional card. Just for real emergencies, Mom, so if you're sick, I can help you. Lucy had access to my money. My breathing quickened. Could they have been that cynical? Had it all been planned? Had they taken me to that restaurant knowing I couldn't pay, expecting that in my desperation I would remember the savings account and give them full access? I felt dizzy. The room spun. I sat on the bed to keep from falling. I looked at the clock on my nightstand. It was 3:30 in the morning. The banks didn't open until 9. I had to wait more than 5 hours to find out if my worst suspicions were true. 5 hours that stretched out like an eternity of torture. I couldn't sleep. I sat on the edge of my bed, watching through the window as the night slowly dissolved into shades of gray and then the pinks of dawn. I heard the neighborhood roosters crowing, the first garbage trucks passing on the street, the bell of the man selling breakfast burritos from his cart. At 6 in the morning, I took a shower. The water was cold because I hadn't turned on the water heater the night before, but the chill helped clear my mind. I scrubbed my skin hard, as if I could also wash away the humiliation, the pain, the feeling of filth I felt inside. I dressed in my most dignified clothes, a pair of black dress pants and a white blouse I saved for important occasions. I combed my hair back, pulling it into a tight bun. I wanted to look strong, serene, not like the broken woman I had been last night. I left the house at 7, though I knew it was ridiculously early. I walked to the main avenue and sat on a park bench across from the bank branch, watching the city wake up. Street vendors set up their fruit and vegetable stands. Children in uniforms walked to school carrying backpacks that looked too heavy for their small backs. Workers with tired faces waited for the bus that would take them to jobs they probably hated, but desperately needed. By 8:30, a line had already formed in front of the bank. I joined it, feeling my heart beat faster and faster. When the doors finally opened at 9 o'clock sharp, I went in with the group of people needing to sort out their financial affairs. The bank's air conditioning hit me like a cold slap. The smell of new paper and disinfectant filled the modern space with its acrylic counters and plastic chairs. I waited my turn in line. In front of me, a young man was arguing heatedly with an employee about an unrecognized charge. Behind me, a woman with 2 small children was trying to keep them still while she reviewed some documents. When it was my turn, a girl no older than 25, with a perfectly made-up face and a professional smile, greeted me. Her name tag said Carla, account executive. "Good morning, how can I help you?" she asked with that practiced cheerfulness they teach you in customer service courses. I took out my bank passbook with visibly shaking hands. I need to know the current balance of my account and review the recent transactions. Carla took the passbook, typed something into her computer, and then her expression subtly changed. The smile remained, but her eyes showed something like concern. "Mrs. Miller, please give me one moment." She got up and went to an office in the back. She returned with an older man in a gray suit and blue tie, whose name tag identified him as the assistant manager. He sat down in front of me and looked at me with an expression that mixed professionalism with a bit of pity. "Mrs. Miller, I'm Assistant Manager Ramirez. I need to confirm some information. Did you authorize any withdrawals from your account in the last 24 hours? I felt the floor open up beneath me. "What withdrawals?" My voice sounded strange, high-pitched, desperate. The assistant manager turned the computer screen towards me. There it was, in black letters on a white background, the evidence of the final betrayal. "Yesterday, at 10 o'clock at night, While I was sitting in that restaurant waiting for them to come back from the restroom, an electronic transfer of $4,000 had been made. At 10:15, another withdrawal of $3,000. And at 10:30, a final one of $1,500. $8,500. Almost my entire account had been emptied in half an hour. The remaining balance was $230. $230 from the nearly $9,000 I had accumulated over 20 years of sacrifice. I stared at the screen, unable to process what I was seeing. The letters blurred as tears filled my eyes. It had been planned. Everything had been calculated with surgical precision. They took me to that expensive restaurant not to thank me for anything, but to distract me while they stole my money. The transfers were made using the mobile app linked to the additional card registered in the name of Lucy Baker. The assistant manager continued in a soft but clear voice. The transfers went to an account in the name of Richard Baker. Technically, since she had authorization on the account, it doesn't constitute a crime. But I understand this must be very difficult for you. It doesn't constitute a crime. Those words echoed in my head. They could steal everything I had, and it wasn't a crime because I, stupid and naive, had given them access to my account. I had signed the papers authorizing them. I had trusted, and that trust had cost me my life savings. Can I do anything? I asked, my voice barely a whisper. Can I get that money back? The assistant manager shook his head slowly. Only if they voluntarily return it, or if you file a civil suit for breach of trust. But I warn you, these cases are long, expensive, and difficult to win when prior authorization exists. What I can do right now is cancel all additional cards and block any access to your account that isn't directly yours. Would you like me to proceed? Yes, I said with a firmness I didn't know I possessed. Cancel everything. I want only me to be able to touch what's left in that account. Carla, the young executive, began typing quickly. She had me sign several documents, explained that the additional cards would be immediately invalidated, that they would change my access codes, that I would receive new cards in the coming days. I signed everything mechanically, like an automaton, while my mind tried to grasp the magnitude of what had happened. I left the bank in a daze. The mid-morning sun momentarily blinded me. The city continued its normal rhythm, indifferent to my personal tragedy. I sat again on the park bench, under the shade of a magnolia tree, and tried to organize my thoughts. I had $230 in the bank. My next month's Social Security check would be $900. That made a total of $1,130. I needed to pay $1,840 to the restaurant in less than a week. The math was brutal, impossible. Even if I sold everything I owned in my house, I wouldn't reach that amount. My phone vibrated. A message. For an absurd second, I hoped it was Lucy, explaining that it had all been a misunderstanding, that they would return the money, that they had played a cruel joke, but that deep down they loved me. But when I looked at the screen, it was a message from the bank confirming the cancellation of the additional cards and the change of passcodes. I dialed Lucy's number again. This time, instead of voicemail, she answered. Her voice sounded irritated, as if I were an annoying telemarketer. What do you want, Mom? There was no trace of guilt, of shame, of acknowledgement of what they had done. Just annoyance, as if I were the one causing problems. Lucy, I said, and my voice sounded calmer than I expected. You took all the money from my account, $8,500, everything I had, and you left me with a debt of over $1,800 that I can't pay. How could you do this to me? There was a silence on the other end. Then I heard voices in the background, Lucy covering the receiver with her hand, talking to someone, probably Richard, deciding what to say, what strategy to use. Finally, her voice returned, but now with a defensive, almost aggressive tone. Mom, we needed that money urgently. Richard has an investment opportunity that's going to make us rich. We'll pay you back with interest, don't be so dramatic. And as for the restaurant bill, well, you signed for it. You're responsible. You're a grown woman, right? Solve your own problems. Every word was a slap. There wasn't an apology, not a, we're sorry, not an, are you okay? Just justifications, accusations, cruelty disguised as pragmatism. When will you pay me back? I asked. though I already knew the answer. When we can, Mom. I don't know. Maybe in a few months. Or a year. Stop pushing. And she hung up. She left me with the phone pressed to my ear, listening to the dead dial tone, feeling something inside me die as well. I sat on that park bench for hours. I watched life pass by in front of me as if I were a ghost. Mothers pushing strollers. Old men playing checkers under another tree. Young couples walking hand in hand. They all had a place in the world. They all belonged to something. I felt like a dry leaf that the wind had torn from its branch and was now just tumbling aimlessly, waiting to disintegrate. The sun began to set, painting the sky in oranges and pinks that in another life would have seemed beautiful to me. Now they were just colors, empty of meaning. My legs had gone numb from sitting for so long. I stood up with difficulty, feeling every one of my 69 years in my protesting joints. I walked without a clear direction, letting my feet carry me through familiar streets that suddenly seemed strange. I passed by the Sacred Heart Church, where I had baptized Lucy 45 years ago. The doors were open, and from inside came the sound of someone practicing on the organ. I went in almost without thinking, drawn by the music and the familiar smell of incense and candles. The church was nearly empty, just an old woman praying in the front pew and the unseen organist practicing what sounded like Ave Maria. I sat in a pew at the back, in the shadows, where no one could see me. I hadn't come to pray. My faith had become something lukewarm years ago, more habit than conviction. But there was something comforting in this space, in its walls that had held the prayers of generations, in its silence that demanded no explanations and passed no judgment. "Are you all right, my dear?" A soft voice made me look up. A nun of about 70, in a brown habit with a face lined with wrinkles that seemed more from smiles than from worries, had sat down next to me without my hearing her approach. Her eyes were a light brown, almost honey-colored, and they looked at me with a warmth that completely disarmed me. "No," I answered with brutal honesty. "I'm not all right." And then, without knowing why, without planning it, I began to tell her everything. The words poured out like water from a broken dam. I told her about the dinner, the abandonment, the stolen money, my daughter who treated me like garbage, the $1,800 I owed and couldn't pay, my entire life dedicated to someone who turned out to be incapable of loving me. The nun, who introduced herself as Sister Teresa, listened in silence. She didn't interrupt, didn't offer religious platitudes, didn't try to convince me that it was all part of God's plan. She simply listened with such complete attention that it made me feel, for the first time in a long time, that my words mattered, that my pain was real and valid. When I finished speaking, exhausted from having emptied my soul, Sister Teresa took my hands in hers, which were surprisingly soft for someone her age. "Deborah," she said, and the way she pronounced my name made it sound almost sacred. "What they have done to you is not just unfair. It is abuse. And no one, listen to me, no one has the right to abuse you, not even your own daughter." Her words resonated with something deep inside me. Abuse. I had never thought of it that way. I had always justified it. That's how families are. Children need help. It's my duty as a mother. But Sister Teresa had just named what I had been unable to see. It wasn't family love. It was systematic abuse. It was emotional and financial exploitation disguised as filial obligations. "I have something that can help with the immediate problem," Sister Teresa continued. "The parish has an emergency fund for women in crisis. It's not much, but we could cover at least part of that restaurant debt while we find a more permanent solution." She took me to the sacristy, where in a small office filled with Bibles and paperwork, she filled out some forms. She explained that the fund had been created by women in the community who understood what it was like to need help in desperate times. "This isn't charity," she told me as I signed the documents. "It's solidarity. We have all been broken at some point. We have all needed someone to extend a hand. Today, it's you. Tomorrow, you will be the one helping another woman." She handed me a check for $1,000. It wasn't enough to cover the whole debt, but it was a lifeline, a small light in the absolute darkness I had been plunged into. I cried again, but these tears were different. They had a measure of relief mixed with the pain. How will I ever repay you? I asked between sobs. Sister Teresa smiled. When you can, if you can. And if you can't, then you will help someone else when you're in a position to do so. That's how this works. Kindness isn't a business transaction, it's a flowing river. I left the church with the check tucked into my purse as if it were the most valuable treasure in the world. The night sky had filled with stars, the kind you rarely see in the city because of the light pollution, but which seemed to shine brighter that night. I walked home with lighter steps, not because my problems had disappeared, but because for the first time in days, I felt that maybe, just maybe, I could survive this. The next day, with Sister Teresa's check and the little I had left, I went to the Aurelia restaurant. Mr. Evans greeted me with the same stern expression, but when I explained that I had $1,000 in cash and needed a payment plan for the rest, his attitude shifted slightly. "We don't do payment plans," he said initially. But then Antoine, the French waiter who had advocated for me that terrible night, came out of the kitchen at that moment and approached. He spoke to Mr. Evans in a low voice, in French, words I didn't understand but whose tone was clearly argumentative. The manager sighed, reviewed some papers, did calculations on a calculator, and finally nodded. "All right. You can pay the $1,000 now. For the rest, $840, I'll give you 3 months. Monthly payments of $280. But I warn you, if you miss a single payment, we will proceed legally without further notice." I agreed. I had no other choice. I signed the new agreement, paid the $1,000, feeling like each bill I handed over was a piece of my dignity I was buying back, and left with my ID recovered, but with a debt that still weighed on my shoulders like a tombstone. $280 a month from a $900 Social Security check. That left me with $620 a month to live on, for food, medicine, transportation, everything. The following days became an exercise in basic survival. I learned to live with an austerity I hadn't known even in my poorest years. I ate once a day, rice and beans, tortillas, the cheapest things I could find at the market. I stopped using gas to heat water, showering with cold water even as winter approached. I walked long distances to save on bus fare. Every dollar became sacred, every coin a small victory in my battle not to sink completely. Lucy never called again, neither did Richard. It was as if I had ceased to exist for them once they had extracted everything they could. A week passed. 2, 3. My daughter's silence hurt more than any insult because it was an active, deliberate silence. A conscious decision to erase me from her life now that I was no longer useful. One afternoon, while I was at the grocery store buying the cheapest vegetables, I heard a familiar voice. "Grandma Deborah?" I turned around and there was Jacob, my 8-year-old grandson, holding the hand of a woman I recognized as Monica, the nanny Lucy had hired a year ago. Jacob let go and ran to me, hugging me with that pure strength only children possess. "I miss you so much, Grandma. Why don't you come to the house anymore?" My heart broke into 1,000 pieces. I knelt down to his level, not caring that my arthritic knees protested, and looked into those dark eyes so much like Lucy's when she was a child. "I miss you too, my love. So much." Monica approached with an uncomfortable expression. "Mrs. Miller, Mrs. Baker forbade me from letting you see the children. She said you were sick, and it was better to keep a distance." Sick? Lucy had told the nanny I was sick. Not a drug addict, not crazy, but sick. Vague enough to justify the isolation, but believable enough that no one would ask uncomfortable questions. It was the perfect lie. I looked at Monica, this young woman in her 30s who seemed genuinely sorry about the situation. "I'm not sick, Monica," I said in a firm voice, "but I understand you have to follow your employer's orders. I don't want to cause you any trouble." I turned to Jacob, stroking his soft hair. "Sweetheart, Grandma is okay, and I love you very much. Never forget that, okay?" Jacob nodded, though his eyes filled with tears. "When are you coming home? Sophia misses you too. She asks about you every night." Every word was a dagger. I had to bite the inside of my cheek to keep from crying in front of him. "Soon, my sweet boy. Soon." It was a lie, but it was the only kind lie I could offer him. Monica gently led Jacob away, giving me one last apologetic look before disappearing among the produce stalls. I stood there between the boxes of tomatoes and the piles of peppers, feeling how Lucy had taken not only my money, but also my grandchildren, the only two people in the world who loved me unconditionally. That night, sitting in my dark kitchen to save electricity, I made a decision. I could not continue to be a victim. I could not continue to let Lucy control my life, my happiness, my access to my own grandchildren. I had to do something, even if I didn't know exactly what. I turned on my phone and started searching for information on grandparents' rights, elder financial abuse, and legal options for low-income individuals. I found a number for a free legal aid center for seniors. The next day, I took 2 buses to get to their offices in downtown Atlanta. The place was modest, in an old building with worn-out tile floors. But the attorney who met with me, a woman in her 40s named Laura Evans, listened with professional attention and gave me information that would change everything. "Mrs. Miller," she said after reviewing the papers I had brought her, "what your daughter and son-in-law did is not technically theft because you gave them authorized access to your account. But there is a legal precedent for breach of familial trust and financial exploitation of the elderly. We can file a civil suit, although I warn you it will be a long process, and there is no guarantee of success." "How much would it cost?" I asked, though I already knew the answer would be beyond my reach. Laura shook her head. "For you, nothing. We work pro bono on cases like this. But there's something else you can do immediately that is just as important. You can petition for visitation rights with your grandchildren. As a grandmother, you have rights. Your daughter cannot simply cut off your access without a valid legal justification." For the first time in weeks, I felt something like hope. It wasn't the naive hope of before, the kind that had led me to trust Lucy blindly. This was something more solid, more informed, more adult. It was the hope of someone who finally understood that she had rights, that she didn't have to accept abuse just because it came from her own blood. We began the legal proceedings. Laura drafted a petition for family visitation, another for the restitution of funds obtained through breach of trust, and helped me gather all the necessary documentation, bank statements, the promissory note from the restaurant, text messages, any evidence that could prove the pattern of abuse. Every document I signed made me feel stronger, as if I were reclaiming pieces of myself that I had lost without even realizing it. The court summons arrived at Lucy's house 2 weeks later. Laura called me that same afternoon. "Prepare yourself, Mrs. Miller. Your daughter will most likely react with anger. It's normal. Abusers rarely accept responsibility without a fight." I didn't have to wait long. At 8 o'clock that night, my phone rang. It was Lucy, and her voice was pure, contained fury. "You're suing me? How dare you, you ungrateful old woman!" She screamed with such intensity I had to pull the phone away from my ear. "After everything we've done for you, after taking you to that fancy restaurant, this is how you repay us? You're ungrateful, selfish, I interrupted her litany of insults with a calm voice, a calmness that surprised even me. "Lucy, listen to me carefully, because I'm only going to say this once. You stole $8,500 from me. You abandoned me with a debt that almost put me in jail. You kept my grandchildren from me with lies. That is not family love. That is abuse. And I am not going to allow it anymore." There was a silence on the other end. Then I heard Richard's voice in the background, cursing, and then Lucy came back on the line with a different, more calculating tone. "Mom, maybe we were hasty. We can talk about this. Come over tomorrow, we'll have dinner, we'll sort it all out as a family. There's no need to get lawyers involved, right? We're family." Her voice was now syrupy, manipulative, the same tone she had used as a child when she wanted something from me. But I was no longer the same woman who fell for that manipulation. "The only family I'm interested in are Jacob and Sophia. With you two, I will only speak through my attorney." And I hung up. My hands were trembling, my heart was pounding, but inside I felt something extraordinary. I felt free. For the first time in decades, I had set a boundary. I had said no. I had prioritized my dignity over the fear of abandonment. The next 2 months were a whirlwind of hearings, legal documents, and constant tension. Lucy and Richard hired an expensive lawyer who tried to portray me as a senile old woman being manipulated by Laura. but the numbers didn't lie. The bank statements clearly showed the transfers made on the night of the dinner. The text messages proved my attempts to communicate and their deliberate silence. The testimony from Monica, the nanny, who finally decided to quit and testify on my behalf, revealed that Lucy had specifically ordered her to keep the children away from me. The judge, a man in his 60s with a stern expression but fair eyes, reviewed all the evidence for weeks. The final hearing was in a small family courtroom with cream-colored walls and that old paper smell all government buildings have. I sat on the left with Laura. Lucy and Richard sat on the right with their lawyer. We did not look at each other. The silence between us was deeper than any ocean. When the judge read his ruling, his voice was clear and firm. After reviewing the evidence presented, this court finds a pattern of financial and emotional abuse towards Mrs. Deborah Miller. The defendants, Lucy Baker and Richard Baker, are ordered to restitute the amount of $8,500 within a period not to exceed 6 months through agreed-upon monthly payments. Furthermore, a mandatory visitation schedule is established between Mrs. Miller and her grandchildren, Jacob and Sophia, to take place every Saturday from 2 to 6 in the afternoon, and every Sunday from 10 in the morning to 2 in the afternoon. Lucy shot to her feet. "This is ridiculous. She gave us that money voluntarily. She can't use my children to punish us." The judge looked at her sternly. "Mrs. Baker, I suggest you sit down and control your temper. The evidence is clear. The withdrawals were made without Mrs. Miller's knowledge or explicit consent at that specific time. And as for visitation with the children, as their grandmother, she has rights that you have violated without legal justification. If you continue to impede these visits, you could face charges for contempt of court." I left the courthouse feeling as though I had climbed a mountain. I was exhausted, but I was also alive in a way I hadn't been in years. Laura hugged me. "You did so well, Deborah. Many women in your situation give up, but you fought, and you won." I didn't feel like I had won exactly. My relationship with my daughter was destroyed, perhaps irreparably, but I had regained something more important, my self-respect. The first visitation Saturday arrived with a mix of excitement and terror that kept me awake all the previous night. I got up at 5 in the morning even though the visit was at 2 in the afternoon. I cleaned my house from top to bottom, though it was already spotless. I baked oatmeal cookies, Jacob's favorite. I bought new crayons and blank paper so Sophia could draw. Every preparation was an act of love, but also of nervousness. Would they remember me? Would they be angry with me? Had their heads been filled with lies about me? At 2 o'clock sharp, the doorbell rang. I opened the door, and there they were, my two treasures, standing timidly on the doorstep. Jacob wore a superhero t-shirt, and Sophia a pink dress with butterflies. Behind them, Richard remained in the car, looking the other way, refusing to even make eye contact. The children looked at me with uncertainty until Sophia broke the ice. "Grandma, is it true you were sick?" I knelt in front of them, ignoring the pain in my knees, and looked them in the eye. "No, my sweet girl. I wasn't sick. I was just very sad because I couldn't see you. But now I can, and that makes me the happiest grandma in the world." Jacob was the first to hug me, immediately followed by Sophia. That hug, those 4 little arms around my neck, was the healing that no doctor could have prescribed. The next 4 hours were magical. We made cookies together, getting the kitchen messy with flour and laughter. Sophia drew me giant flowers with bright colors while Jacob told me endless stories about school, his friends, a soccer game he had played. They didn't mention their parents, and I didn't ask. This time was ours. Sacred. An oasis in the middle of the desert my life had become. When 6 o'clock came and Richard returned for them, both children protested. "Do we have to go already? Can't we stay longer?" My heart swelled and broke simultaneously. "I'll see you tomorrow, my loves. We'll be together again tomorrow." This time they did look back as they left, and I saw in their faces a mixture of relief and happiness that made me understand that this court-ordered visitation was the right thing. Weekends became our routine. Saturdays were for crafts, games, and cooking. On Sundays, I took them to Piedmont Park, where we ran among the trees, fed the ducks in the lake, and ate snow cones sitting on green-painted benches. Every week, I felt myself being reborn a little more. The children were giving me back something Lucy had taken away. A purpose. A reason to keep going. 3 months passed. Lucy and Richard didn't speak to me beyond the minimal exchanges necessary for the visit logistics. But something interesting began to happen. The first 2 restitution payments arrived on time, deposited into my account without a message, without any acknowledgement, just cold, mechanical bank transfers. They were payments of $1,416.60 each, as the judge had ordered to complete the $8,500 in 6 months. With that money, I could finally breathe. I paid off the rest of the restaurant debt. I bought real food, not just rice and beans. I fixed the water heater that had been broken for months. They were small luxuries that would be normal for anyone else, but for me, they were monumental victories. Every purchase I made without having to count every last cent was a reminder that I had survived, that I had fought, and had not let myself be destroyed. One Sunday afternoon, while Jacob was on the swings and Sophia was building castles in the sandbox, a woman sat down on the bench next to me. She was about 65, with gray hair cut in a modern style and a kind smile. "Excuse me for intruding," she said, "but I've been watching you with your grandchildren for weeks. You can just see the love they have. It's beautiful to see." We started talking. Her name was Eleanor. She was a widow and came to the park every Sunday to feed the pigeons. She told me her own children lived across the country and rarely visited. "Sometimes I feel like I raised strangers," she confessed sadly. "I gave them everything, and now I barely get a call on my birthday." Her story resonated with me, but it also made me see a crucial difference. I had taken action. I had defended myself. I had not waited for crumbs of affection. Eleanor and I became friends. She started joining us on our Sunday afternoons. She would bring bread to feed the ducks, sometimes buy popsicles for the children. Her presence added another dimension to my new life. I discovered that I could build a chosen family, a support network that didn't depend on blood ties but on mutual respect and genuine affection. One evening, 5 months after the ruling, as I was preparing dinner in my kitchen, I heard a knock at the door. It wasn't a visitation day. I opened it cautiously and came face to face with Lucy. She was alone, without Richard, without the children. She looked tired, with deep dark circles under her eyes and her hair less kempt than usual. We looked at each other in silence for what felt like minutes but was probably only seconds. "Can I come in?" she asked in a small voice, so different from the demanding tone she always used. I didn't move right away. Part of me wanted to slam the door in her face, to give back even a fraction of the pain she had caused me. But another part, that maternal part that never completely dies no matter how much damage it takes, was curious. I nodded and stepped aside. Lucy entered the house where she had grown up as if it were a strange place. She looked around, noticing the changes I'd made. New cushions on the sofa, a plant in the window, pictures of Jacob and Sophia in new frames. She sat on the edge of the sofa, her hands clasped in her lap, and for a long time said nothing. "Richard and I are getting a divorce," she finally said, her voice barely a whisper. I didn't feel satisfaction hearing this, contrary to what I might have expected. I just felt an empty sadness, like when you recognize that something that once had value has been destroyed beyond repair. That investment he told you about never existed. It was a lie. He spent all your money, my money, on a mistress he had in Miami, some 26-year-old girl who works at the resort where he claimed to have work meetings. Tears began to roll down her cheeks, smudging her expensive makeup. "I've lost everything, Mom. The apartment is about to be foreclosed on because we haven't paid the mortgage. The bank repossessed the BMW. My friends won't talk to me anymore because I borrowed money I can't pay back. And the kids keep asking me why Daddy doesn't live with us anymore." Part of me wanted to feel pity. Part of me wanted to hug her like when she was a little girl and had nightmares. But a larger, wiser, stronger part, fortified by pain, simply observed this scene with emotional distance. "And you're telling me this because—" I asked in a neutral voice. Lucy looked up, her eyes red and swollen. "Because I realized you were right. That Richard was a manipulator. That I was a victim too." I shook my head slowly. "No, Lucy. You weren't just a victim. You were his accomplice. You made the decision to steal that money from me. You decided to abandon me in that restaurant. You chose to keep my grandchildren from me. Richard is responsible for his actions, but you are responsible for yours." She flinched at my words as if they were physical blows. "I know," she whispered. "I know, and I'm sorry. I'm so sorry, Mom. If I could turn back time—" I cut her off. "But you can't. And saying I'm sorry doesn't erase what you did. It doesn't bring back the months I spent thinking about ending my own life because I saw no way out.